We're about to do some things. Right, buckle up, guys. This is hopefully going to be the final video in the Guild Wars 2 meta saga. Although honestly, maybe it won't be. Maybe it won't be over even now. Because what I wanted to talk about today actually was a few of my concerns with End of Dragons and the way End of Dragons is actually going to play out in terms of the builds and also the issues with the metagame and the way Guild Wars 2 is from a design standpoint that currently need to be addressed. And the problem is that utility is very centered around class. This is a very multifaceted issue, actually. It's incredibly complicated, and I will do my best to express it in the best way that I possibly can, but it's certainly not going to be easy. In my opinion, the thing with Guild Wars 2 is the way the game plays out forces certain builds into the meta very aggressively, but it's very much like a chicken and the egg. These things feed into each other. So, number one, certain professions and builds are the complete package. That is to say, they can do everything within their area of the game, within that role. I think the ultimate example of this is actually Druid. I think Druid might be the most complete build in the game, and that's no surprise. So Druid was actually the first healer in the game, like Tempest was as well, but Druid kind of took center stage. This profession, rather this specialization, was entirely designed around raids. Like, everything about it screams raids. And the problem is that it's actually in some ways unique in this. Like, Firebrand also has this a lot, I think, because it's so versatile. But the problem is that the versatility of Druid means that the only way to replace a Druid is to be more versatile. And this is why I need the Microsoft Paint here. I'm going to draw you guys a diagram. Here's the issue with this. The really big thing that players want in Guild Wars 2 actually isn't necessarily the optimal composition. It's like the thing that's going to be the easiest to do, easiest to organize, and easiest to use. So I'm going to use green for Druid here. Actually, here we go. So we got some axes on this graph, guys. So basically, right, imagine that each one of these is an individual boss down here. Like, these are all encounters, right? So these are bosses, right? This is bosses, and up top here, this is effect. Wait, actually, we could do power level, right? Power level. So this is the power level as you go up here. Now, Druid is actually basically good everywhere. So Druid is, you know, it's a little bit like this. It's a wiggly line, right? A little bit like this. It's really good there, right? But in general, it's pretty stable. Now, the problem is that other builds like Tempest, even though they are really strong, they're a lot weaker in certain areas. For example, Tempest is a lot better on fights like Veil Guardian because it heals a lot more. But then again, it really suffers on Veil Guardian because it can't do the pushing, right? So that's actually a really bad example. It's a lot better on fights that require intensive healing, right? So it's going to be great on stuff like Gorseval, great on stuff like Doom, on Sabir, it's amazing. Adina, it's amazing. So it's really good in some places, but oh, there's Veil Guardian, and it's really bad compared to Druid there because it can't entangle, it can't push, right? And then it kind of goes back up again, and it's really good in a lot of places. But Desmina, no. Tempest not great on Desmina as the primary support, right? And then it goes back up again like this. And the issue is that this stuff here, even though that, yeah, Tempest is actually better than Druid in a lot of situations, it isn't always. And the fact that it's good, and the fact that Druid is good everywhere means that Druid is always going to be picked more, right? And kind of here is like the threshold. Here's like the threshold of goodness. So anything below that line, it's going to be annoying to play with. Because if you play with a Tempest, right, on Veil Guardian and only a Tempest, that is actually a pain in the ass because the Seekers are going to get you. If you play on Soulless Horror, you won't be able to push the Golems with your Tempest. That's really annoying, okay? So what's actually the problem here? Well, the problem is that Druid is always above this line, right? And so is Firebrand. Firebrand is honestly, like, arguably even more dominant than Druid. Like, Firebrand is kind of a similar kind of like, oh, wait, no, I don't want that, right? Firebrand's a very similar thing here. We'll do like a little light blue, right? Firebrand's like this kind of like wiggly line. It's about here, right? You know, it's really good here, like blah, 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 right? Like Firebrand in general is amazing everywhere. It's like never bad. And the same thing would be Scourge. I won't do Scourge. That will be complicated, okay? Then we've got 2 greens. That's too much. But what am I trying to get at here? Like, what's the issue? Well, the issue is that having a build that is the complete package means that every build that isn't also the complete package will always be unpopular within the meta. So I think what needs to happen with Druid is that it needs to have some of its utility removed. This is particularly true with End of Dragons, because End of Dragons actually does this very, very well. End of Dragons actually... the elite specializations are actually very limited in the toolkit they have. They're not overstacked with crazy utility at a baseline. And if you want to perform a certain role, if you want to give Harbinger quickness, you're going to have to invest in that. If you want to give Barrier and support on Spectre, yeah, you're going to really have to commit to that, right? If you want to give a lot of boons on, say, a Catalyst or on a Vindicator, you're going to have to commit to that. You're going to have to make a trade-off. The problem is that Druid doesn't. It does not have any trade-offs. It has so much flexibility and so much value that it will always dominate the meta, even if you nerf it. Fairly significantly. And the same is true with Firebrand. Firebrand is just so good everywhere that it doesn't matter if it's not optimal everywhere. Like, for example, you know, on certain encounters, like Mirage really outperforms everything in the game, right? Like hardcore. You know, it's just god tier on fights like, you know, here we go, Lagos, right? It's like, whoa, it's all the way up here, right? On other fights, it tends to underperform though a fair bit, right? But the thing is that a lot of the time you'll see people stack Firebrands anyway, right, on something like Lagos, because it doesn't matter that Mirage is optimal. The difference between like good enough and optimal isn't sufficient. And in general, it's convenience, right? Convenience is a huge thing here, right? Like if you have the ability to play one build on every boss, that's way less gearing for a new player, way more convenient in the LFG. If you have this kind of jack of all trades, it's going to work on every single boss. It's just going to be the better option in general. And that's true of Scourge, okay? I'm not putting Scourge on there, but like imagine Scourge is like here, right? Scourge is like amazing on every single encounter in the entire game, except I guess arguably it's not amazing on Conjured Amalgamate, although it is good enough to do it. Funnily enough, it would never dip below that, you know, the dotted line here, like the bad line. Let's label that as well, guys. This is the bad line here, okay? The badness line. And to be fair, Mirage, look, I'm doing this for effect. Mirage doesn't actually really cross below the bad line anyway, particularly now with Torment the way it is, but you get the picture, right? You get the idea. Mirage actually surprisingly good everywhere because of that damage change. Doesn't matter though. But this is the forbidden zone, guys. You don't want to be here, right? And the fact that Druid never goes below it is actually a problem. Now, what I would probably do is remove Might, but I'm not here to talk solutions, really. I want to just describe the problem so that people understand why things are the way they are. I mean, I guess I have kind of talked about solutions, but that doesn't matter. The important thing here, gamers, is that adding these hyper-versatile, hyper-all-rounder builds will cause them to always dominate the meta in Guild Wars 2. And if we really want to fix some of these things, then we need to actually strip back some of this baseline utility from the specializations currently in the game. Otherwise, what comes out with End of Dragons will not help. Harbinger can't compete with Scourge. Catalyst does a lot of damage, but I don't think it will see a lot of play because, again, it doesn't have the utility of other DPS options. Other healers, Spectre, I don't think it can compete with Firebrand because, again, it just doesn't have that complete package that Firebrand has, right? And none of the End of Dragon specs do. Now, I think that's a good thing, but the problem is you can't ignore what's already in the game, right? And you can say, well, why don't you just buff Tempest? Well, the issue with buffing Tempest is that Tempest isn't actually imbalanced. In fact, it will overperform against Druid on a lot of encounters. It's going to be a much safer kill on something like Sabir, better boon uptimes with protection and so on basically every encounter. It will heal way more on something like Veil Guardian if you have someone else do the pushing, right? Or you can try and do some like weird stuff with your Warhorn to knock things away. It has the boons. It actually is balanced, right? It has more healing, but it's not as flexible. Druid can change its weapon, right? It can take Glyph of the Tides. It can take Entangle, right? It has damage modifiers that it can bring to the table. Druid is better on average, right? But Tempest outperforms it somewhere. But the problem is that you have to factor in LFG convenience how easy is it to build a group around something, and how easy is it to play that on every encounter. Because most players don't want to be relogging or having to find new players in every encounter, and this is actually a really important concept with regards to balance, is versatility. And look at the current meta right now, guys. What's dominating? What's dominating is Firebrand, Scourge, Druid, right? What do all of those have in common? They are unbelievably flexible. They can do everything. Druid has projectile destruction, it has immobilize, it has knockbacks, it has great CC, it has healing, it has nearly every boon in the game. It's got everything on the table, right? And Firebrand, it can do healing, it can give quickness, it can do DPS, it can reflect, it can block, it has stability, right? And Scourge, it does damage everywhere really well. It has barrier, it has support, it has tanky, it can revive, it can CC, it can epidemic, right? It can pull mobs in. It just does everything, right? And a lot of other builds in the game, like Weaver, don't do everything. In fact, they do very little. A lot of damage specs are like this in the game, and that's why they will never see play. In my opinion, if we want to see this diversity in the meta, then we need desperate change to some of the current builds in the game with the way they're designed on a fundamental level. They either need to suffer a really big DPS tax for the amount of utility they have to make less utility-focused options more appealing, or that design needs to be reined in significantly. If that doesn't happen, then we're not really ever going to break away from the way the game is currently played. This is even more true in Fractals. I think Firebrand is a serious issue in Fractals for this exact reason. It's just too versatile. And also, Firebrand is a slight special case because there's a really big problem with Firebrand in particular, and it's about unique boon application. One of the really big problems with Firebrand, in general, in every game mode, or Guardian in every game mode more specifically, is that it has a borderline monopoly on stability in particular. It's true that Chronomancer actually has a good amount of it, with the mantra of concentration and well of precognition, but not to the extent and not with the same level of role compression that Firebrand can bring to the table. That is a huge problem. Boon exclusivity needs to stop. It really, really does. Like, these effects are so powerful, particularly in Fractals. Stability and Aegis are ridiculously broken in Fractals, and that needs to change, right? Either more attacks need to be unblockable or unstabilityable in Fractals, so in other words, you lose value on your Guardian, or there needs to be other sources of these boons on other professions and other specializations to the group. Otherwise, you're never breaking free. This was actually one of the things that I was really disappointed with about Ender Dragons. All of the elite specializations don't really solve problems with the game. Like, maybe this is a little bit too pragmatic, a little bit too soulless and cold, but I view elite specializations and new builds coming into the game as opportunities to fix imbalance and fix problems in the game. And I don't really see that happening right now with the Ender Dragons elite specializations. In fact, my prediction right now is that essentially not much will actually change in the Pug metagame when Ender Dragons drops. Now, that might end up being incorrect because they might massively nerf stuff or massively buff stuff in Ender Dragons, but looking at the state of the beta that we saw at the end of the last beta test, realistically, almost none of that stuff would really see a lot of play in normal Guild Wars 2. When I say normal Guild Wars 2, I mean just pug groups, LFGs, like random casual fun, right? Like playing that stuff. Like you'd see it in open world and PvP and probably world versus world. But in instance PvE, I do not think it would be very significantly affected whatsoever, right? And that to me is a really big problem. There's actually one thing I want to touch on here as well. I think the current boon meta is unbelievably unhealthy. The fact that current support builds are so role compressed and are optimized and built around 100% boon uptime on about 6 or 7 boons is catastrophically unhealthy. So why is this a problem? Well, back in the day, if you had a DPS build that could apply protection, that was actually a really big deal, right? Because it meant that you actually had that boon. Because back in the day, protection was a lot harder to come by, and boons in general were a lot harder to come by. They weren't 10 target, and they didn't have such high durations, and you also didn't have Harrier gear too, so boon duration in general was harder to get. But right now, guys, if I want to apply 25 might, protection, vigor, and regen to 10 people, all I do is literally use all of my abilities off cooldown. This means that any build that can't do 25 stacks of might permanently is useless. It means that any build that can't do perma protection is essentially useless, right? So this is way too binary for the game to be balanced, in my opinion. Like, for example, a really interesting thing could be if you had an Arcane Weaver, right? Because Weaver swaps achievements a lot, so it can activate the area of effect boons on elemental attunement very, very frequently. This is a really interesting thing about Weaver, right? So this means that, when you played Staff Weaver, you actually gave really good protection uptime and even swiftness uptime while you were playing your Staff Weaver. That meant that not only were you doing DPS, you also had some baked-in utility. Now, that is useless. Totally worthless. That, even if you did play this, they nerfed Arcane and Staff really hard, so you wouldn't play that, but even if you did, it would be useless because it would already be covered by something else. And the problem is, it's all done by one character. Supports being overtuned massively hurts the DPS meta in Guild Wars 2 because it means that all of the boon utility that might come packaged with a DPS class is redundant because it will already be carried over by a support. This is not good at all. It means that DPS will always be boiled down to whoever has the most damage will be the one that everyone wants to play, right? Essentially, right? Or the one that can do the most unique things will always be that. Having everything handled by the support isn't good. It's honestly really unhealthy for the game in general. Having permanent protection the entire time is honestly not good design. It means that it's really hard to express this idea, actually. Having permanent every boon in the game, in a way, means that the boons don't mean anything, because the devs will have to design the encounter around you always having those boons anyway. So if you have protection on you permanently, the devs will assume that you do and just make the damage 33% higher, meaning that nothing's changed, right? Like, having all of that sustain and healing from the region and vigor, well, the devs now assume that you have that. They have to, otherwise they're going to undertune the encounter, right? So it means that there's no differential in player power throughout the encounter, and it means that your ability timing becomes incredibly spammy and incredibly useless, right? You don't think about the way you use your abilities anymore because you're going for 100% uptime. Like, when you apply boons means nothing because you always have them. It's like, ooh, there's lots of damage coming in now, apply region and protection. No, you don't. You always have it. Big burst phase, apply quickness and might. No, you always have it. These things are fundamental problems that actually challenge PvE a lot, actually, right? Like, it is a very, very big problem. It really, really is, guys, with the way the game actually operates, right? It's very serious. Okay, very, very serious indeed. And I'm not saying they should add loads of extra unique modifiers, right, and stuff like that. Like, that's not what you're supposed to do here, obviously, right? But it needs to be that boons are much more spread out with the way that you're going to be applying them, right? And it needs to be a thing that DPS classes can actually provide rather than having it all centralized on supports. That also goes for general mechanics as well. For example, the fact that in general, in Guild Wars 2 raids, most mechanics will be handled by supports on their own is actually bad. Not only does it make the encounter less interesting and less dynamic, most players sitting behind the host basically just like pumping away on their meters. That isn't good off the bat, but it also, one, makes it very, very high pressure for new support players, and most players kind of aren't doing anything, but it makes the encounter design itself a little bit weird, because like one player is basically going to do everything while everyone else is DPSs. Well, that's not how it should be, right? You should have to have this group effort of all these players working together to handle these mechanics, right? Druid could be healing and applying some boons. The warrior could be knocking the tormented dead away, right? Or someone else could be pushing Seekers away. Having everything centralized onto one role just makes it even more like immovable, right? Like immobile, right? Like it makes it even worse than it already is. And the fact that abilities are just like ridiculously spammy now and require basically no thought when you use them. Again, this is moving ArenaNet into a very, very tough spot with their encounter design. Because the issue is that it's very hard to actually make a challenging encounter in Guild Wars 2 because you have every boon in the game basically permanently. Your support classes are insanely overpowered. and you also have 1 million DPS. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying I want to make the game impossible for everyone, but I think that we need to have a very serious conversation about fundamentally changing the way some builds work in Guild Wars 2. Because as of right now, I think we're going down a very, very scary pathway with the way the game has been power crept and designed over time, right? Yeah, that's basically it. I'm bringing up my image again. Have a look at it. Enjoy it. Take a look at that. So, let's talk about solutions. I don't want to add loads of unique modifiers to the game. What I want to do is to add more options. So loads of DPS specs should apply boons as well. Supports should have boons taken away, and it should be way less centralized on the support. But DPS should have protection. They should have fury. They should have swiftness. They should have, might even, right? It should all be it should be spread out amongst all the players. So maybe Weaver can give 25 might. Right? That will actually be really good, because it could do like 35k DPS, 25 might to its party. Awesome. Great. That's super good. Right? You could have it also give Fury as well, if you wanted might and Fury at the same time. Phalanx, Strength, Weaver. Right? And giving utility means that you can kind of mix and match. Oh, we want a might source, we want this, we want that, we want this, all over the place. And you kind of bundle it all together in that way, as opposed to having, right, we have one support who does everything, and the DPS, who cares? Right? And the other issue here is that if all of the boons are handled by one person, then all you care about in your DPS specs are the things that the healer can't do. It's why Firebrand is so good, right? Because Firebrand can give Aegis and stability, Druid can't do that. Scourge can give barrier, Druid can't do that. And the problem with that is that it will incentivize playing only those DPS specs, because all the other DPS specs don't actually do anything that you don't already have. Does that make any sense? So I'm saying that we just spread these mechanics out a lot more. I would say the same with barrier, Aegis, and stability should be spread out way more across different things. Loads more build variety there as well. But most importantly, boons should be spread out significantly to different builds and applied from different sources rather than just one. Because the problem is, if you only have some of them, or you have to give up a lot to do it, then realistically, it's not going to be worth it, right? If a support can do it all for you, then no one's ever going to put loads of things together and said. The other option is you could give everything to everything, I guess. So in other words, you could basically give Tempest the Glyph of the Tides, right, to like even out some of these peaks. But the problem with doing that is it actually makes the problem worse, in my opinion. If you give everything every piece of utility, well, I've got some very bad news for you. Now you're only ever gonna pick the one that does it the best, right? Like we see this a lot, right? When there's a really dominant DPS class, people only want to play with that very dominant DPS class. So if everything does everything, then you get no variety, because people just stack that one thing over and over again, like with Necro and Firebrand and Fractals, right? So I think you do need to have things that are a little bit, they're like decent everywhere, but there are significant advantages and disadvantages to having these things in other locations to really promote people playing different things and accepting different things. Because right now, like Tempest is actually really good. I recommend people play it. But the thing is, I don't think I really see that changing with Druid being where it is right now. Like Druid and Firebrand being where it is right now probably means that it's going to be hard to dislodge them from the meta, because again, they're just much more versatile. So like, the versatility element of some of these builds massively causes them to end up being overrepresented in the metagame. I guess that's the big thing that I've been trying to express. Hopefully I did a good job of it. I've been wanting to do this video for a long time, but it's really hard. I always struggle with doing it. But yeah, bottom line, hyper versatile, hyper flexible builds are incredibly oppressive to the meta. And as long as they exist, other builds will really, really struggle to ever get a foothold in commonplace, everyday play, right? Like, if you look at records, you actually see a crazy amount of build variety. Like high-level play, record, speedruns, there's huge build variety. But in normal play, there isn't, because, again, in a speedrun, people are very happy to play these niche specialist builds for different encounters, but that's just not, it's not realistic for pug groups, right? But there you go. There you go. That is the real problem with the Guild Wars 2 balance and design, and one of the reasons why I'm a little bit worried about End of Dragons elite specializations without knowing some fairly significant adjustments to what we currently have here in the game. Boom.